Dear friend, if you only knew how close heaven truly is when you begin to pray not with your lips, not with memorized words, but with your heart. Because prayer was never meant to be a routine, never meant to be something you check off like a task completed. It is something far deeper, far more intimate. It is the breath of the soul, the place where eternity touches time, where the invisible begins to move into the visible, where what seems impossible quietly begins to shift. But many have reduced prayer to something mechanical, something repeated, something familiar, something safe, words spoken out of habit, not out of hunger. And then they wonder why nothing happens, why heaven feels silent, why their prayers seem to fall back to the ground. It is not because God is distant. It is not because he is unwilling. It is because prayer was never designed to work without the heart. God is not listening for perfection. He is not waiting for the right structure, the right tone, the right spiritual language. He is listening for truth, for a soul that dares to be real, a soul that comes without hiding, without pretending, without trying to impress, a soul that simply says, I need you. I cannot do this without you. I want you more than anything else. That is where prayer begins. And yet, that is exactly where many stop. Because to be real with God requires surrender. It requires letting go of control, letting go of image, letting go of the need to appear strong. And many would rather say the right words than open the real heart. But the Holy Spirit is not drawn to performance. He is drawn to authenticity. He comes where there is honesty. He moves where there is openness. He fills what is empty, not what is pretending to be full. And when you begin to pray like that, something shifts. Not always in your circumstances at first, but deep within you, the pressure begins to loosen. The weight begins to lift. The noise begins to quiet. Because now you are no longer trying to reach God through effort. You are encountering him through surrender. And in that moment, before any answer comes, before any miracle appears, something greater has already begun. His presence has entered. And that is where everything changes. So many are praying today, yet nothing seems to change. Not because heaven is closed, not because God is silent, but because what they call prayer has become routine instead of relationship, repetition instead of revelation, words instead of presence. They speak, but their heart is not open. They ask, but they have not surrendered. They repeat what they have heard others say, but inside they are still holding on, still trying to control the outcome, still trying to understand everything before they trust anything. And the Holy Spirit, he does not move in that environment. Not because he has rejected you, but because he responds to what is real. You can pray long and still feel empty. You can say all the right things and still remain unchanged. Because prayer was never meant to be measured by how much you say, how loud you speak, or how spiritual you sound. It is measured by how present you are. There is a kind of prayer that heaven cannot ignore. Not because it is perfect, but because it is real. A prayer that comes from a heart that stops pretending, stops performing, stops trying to do it right, and simply opens. A prayer that says, God, this is where I am, this is what I feel, this is what I cannot fix. And in that honesty, something begins to shift. Because now, you are no longer trying to reach God through effort. You are allowing him to meet you in truth. The Holy Spirit is drawn to authenticity. He comes where there is no mask, no pressure, no religious performance, only a heart that is willing to be seen. And when he comes, he does not always begin by changing your situation. He begins by changing you. The tension softens. The striving quiets. The fear begins to loosen its hold. Because his presence carries something your effort never could. Peace. And suddenly, prayer is no longer dry. It is no longer something you push through. It becomes something you enter into. A place where you are not forcing words, but experiencing connection. This is the shift from speaking at God to being with him. And when that happens, everything about prayer changes. And when prayer becomes real, when it moves from routine into relationship, you begin to discover something most people never experience, that prayer is not just speaking, it is encountering, not just asking, but abiding, not just reaching toward God, but becoming aware that He is already near. There is a depth in prayer that cannot be accessed through effort. It is entered through stillness, through the moment when you stop trying to say the right thing and simply become present. Because the Holy Spirit does not rush, and He is not found in noise. He is found in the quiet place where the heart settles, where the mind slows down, where the soul finally stops striving. Many people pray with busy thoughts, anxious hearts, and hurried words. They rush in, speak quickly, and leave just as fast, never realizing that prayer was never meant to be rushed. It was meant to be dwelled in, because there is a voice that does not compete with noise. There is a presence that does not force itself into chaos. And if you are not still, you will miss it. There is something holy about silence in prayer. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of trust. The silence that says, Lord, I don't need to control this moment. I don't need to understand everything. I just need to be with you. And in that stillness, He begins to speak. Not always in words you can hear with your ears, but in impressions, in peace, in a quiet knowing that settles deep within you. A clarity that does not come from reasoning, but from presence. This is where real prayer begins to take shape. Not when you are speaking the most, but when you are listening the deepest. Not when you are trying the hardest, but when you are yielding the most. Because the Holy Spirit is not drawn to effort, He's drawn to rest. And when you learn to be still, not out of passivity, but out of trust, you begin to experience something many never reach. A communion that goes beyond words, a connection that does not need to be explained. And in that place, something shifts again. Your heart becomes quieter. Your thoughts become clearer. Your spirit becomes more aware. Because now, you are no longer just praying, you are encountering. And when you begin to encounter the Holy Spirit in that way, not just speaking, but listening, not just asking, but abiding, something else becomes clear. Prayer is not only about intimacy, it is also about invitation, because nothing truly begins to shift until He is welcome. Many rush into prayer with a list, needs, problems, requests, one after another, as if prayer were a transaction. But the power of prayer does not begin with asking. It begins with honoring, with acknowledging His presence before anything else. Because the Holy Spirit is not a force to be used. He is a person to be welcomed. And this is where many miss it. They want what He can do, but they do not pause for who He is. They want the answer, the healing, the breakthrough, but they skip the invitation. And without His presence, words remain words. Nothing carries weight until He is there. That is why everything changes with 3 simple words. Come, Holy Spirit. Not rushed, not repeated without thought, but spoken with awareness, with honor, with desire. Because when you truly invite Him, not as a visitor, but as Lord, you are making space for heaven to move. And when He comes, you feel it. Not always in something dramatic, but in something deeper. A settling, a peace, a presence that fills the room, fills your heart, fills the moment in a way that cannot be explained. And here is the mystery. Before you even ask for anything, something is already happening. The burden begins to lift. The fear begins to loosen. The atmosphere begins to change. Because the miracle was never just what you were asking for. The miracle is Him. When His presence fills a place, everything that belongs to Him comes with Him. Peace comes, clarity comes, power comes, healing begins before it is even spoken. This is why invitation matters more than explanation, because you cannot reason your way into a miracle, but you can welcome the one who performs it. And when you begin to live this way, inviting Him first, honoring Him first, placing Him above every request, prayer is no longer something you control. It becomes something you enter. And once the Holy Spirit is truly welcomed, everything about prayer begins to shift again. Because now it is no longer about trying to get something from God. It becomes about giving everything to Him. And this is where many hesitate, because this is the place of surrender. We like to pray for change, but we struggle to release control. We ask God to move, but we still hold tightly to how it should happen, when it should happen, what it should look like. And without realizing it, we are asking Him to act while refusing to let Him lead. But the Holy Spirit does not move in control. He moves in surrender. There comes a moment in real prayer where words begin to fade and something deeper takes over. A quiet, yielding, a decision that says, Lord, not my way but yours. Not my timing but yours. Not my understanding but your will. And that moment is where everything begins. Because as long as you are holding everything together, there is no space for Him to take over. As long as you are trying to manage the outcome, you are still standing in the place where He is meant to move. The Holy Spirit does not compete with your control. He waits for your release. And when that release happens, even quietly, even without dramatic emotions, something shifts immediately. Not always in your circumstances at first, but within you. The pressure begins to lift. The need to figure everything out begins to loosen, because now you are no longer carrying it alone. This is why some of the greatest breakthroughs do not happen in moments of intensity, but in moments of surrender. When a heart finally says, I trust you, even if I don't understand. I release this, even if I don't see the outcome yet. And in that place, heaven responds, not because you forced it, but because you made room for it. Because surrender is not loss. It is alignment. And alignment is where the power of the Holy Spirit begins to flow without resistance. And when surrender becomes real, not just words, not just a moment, but a posture, something sacred begins to take place. Prayer is no longer something you visit. It becomes something you live. Not a time you set aside, but an awareness you carry. And this is where communion with the Holy Spirit begins to deepen in a way that changes everything. You begin to realize that prayer was never meant to be occasional. It was meant to be continuous. Not always spoken, not always expressed in words, but present. A quiet connection that remains whether you are speaking or silent, moving or still. And slowly, almost without noticing, your life begins to shift. You no longer separate spiritual moments from normal life, because everything becomes spiritual. Your thoughts begin to change. Your reactions begin to soften. Your decisions begin to carry a different weight, not because you are trying harder, but because you are no longer living alone. The Holy Spirit becomes present in the ordinary, in your conversations, in your choices, in your quiet moments when no one else sees. And the more you acknowledge Him, the more aware you become. The more aware you become, the more sensitive you become. And the more sensitive you become, the more clearly you begin to recognize His leading, not as something distant, but as something within. A pause before you speak. A check when something is not right. A quiet nudge towards something you did not plan. This is how He leads, not by forcing, but by guiding. And when you follow that leading, even in small things, you begin to see something unfold that you could never have created on your own. Paths begin to align. Situations begin to shift. Doors begin to open in ways that do not make sense naturally. Because now you are not living by impulse. You are living by presence. There is a peace that begins to settle over your life, not because everything around you is perfect, but because something within you is stable. You no longer need to control every outcome, no longer need to understand every detail, because you trust the one who is with you. And that trust changes how you live. And as you continue walking in that kind of communion, not visiting His presence, but living in it, something deeper begins to happen. Your inner world starts to change. Not forced, not immediate, but steady, undeniable. Because the Holy Spirit does not only guide your steps, He transforms your nature. Things that once pulled you begin to lose their hold. Desires that once felt strong begin to fade. Thoughts that once controlled you begin to quiet. Not because you are fighting harder, but because something within you is being reshaped. This is the difference between behavior and transformation. Behavior can be controlled for a time. You can discipline yourself, resist certain things, adjust your actions, but eventually what is unchanged inside will surface again. But when the Holy Spirit begins to work within you, change is no longer external, it becomes internal. And when it becomes internal, it becomes lasting. You no longer have to force yourself to avoid what is wrong. You begin to lose the desire for it. You no longer struggle the same way because you are no longer the same person. That is freedom. Not constant effort, but inner shift. You begin to love what brings peace. You begin to seek what carries life. You begin to step away from what disturbs your spirit, not out of fear, but out of awareness. Because now you can discern. You can feel what aligns and what does not. And that sensitivity becomes your guide. It begins to shape your decisions, your relationships, your environment. You are no longer driven by impulse or temporary emotions. You are led by alignment with His presence. And that changes everything. Because now your life is no longer a constant battle against yourself. It becomes a process of becoming someone new. And the more you yield to that transformation, the deeper it goes. Not just on the surface, but at the root. In your thoughts, your reactions, your identity, until one day you look back and you realize you are no longer who you used to be. Not because you tried harder, but because you walked closer. And this is where everything finally comes together, not in a single dramatic moment, not in something you can point to and say, this is where it all changed, but in a life that has been quietly transformed through communion, surrender, and the constant presence of the Holy Spirit. A life that no longer depends on circumstances to feel steady because it is anchored in something deeper. When the Holy Spirit becomes your life, not just part of your life, you stop chasing what the world chases. Not because you are trying to be different, but because you have found something greater. Something that does not fade, does not fluctuate, does not depend on what happens around you. You begin to live from peace, not toward it, and that changes everything. Situations may still shift, challenges may still come, delays may still happen, but they no longer shake you the same way, because your stability is no longer built on outcomes, it is built on presence. And presence remains. There is a quiet confidence that begins to form, not loud, not visible to everyone, but deeply rooted. A knowing that you are not alone, a certainty that even when you do not understand, you are still being led. And that removes fear, not because you have all the answers, but because you trust the one who does. This is the life many are searching for, but looking for in the wrong places. They look for it in success, in control, in certainty, in people, but all of those things can change, can fail, can disappear. But His presence does not. And when your life is built on that, everything else begins to align. Your identity becomes steady. Your peace becomes consistent. Your direction begins to unfold naturally. Because now, you are no longer trying to create your life. You are allowing Him to lead it. And this is where true freedom is found, not in having everything go your way, but in no longer needing it to. Not in controlling outcomes, but in trusting the one who holds them. So if there is anything left in you that is still holding on, still trying to control, still trying to understand everything, this is the moment to release it. Not as loss, but as surrender. Let Him lead. Let Him guide. Let Him become everything. And you will discover something that cannot be taken from you. A life that is steady, a peace that remains, a direction that unfolds. Because when the Holy Spirit is no longer something you visit, but someone you live with, everything changes.